In 2013, Langdon Cook published The Mushroom Hunters on the Trail of an Underground America. It's an amazing story by a talented writer. We all know Langdon, so let's get right to it and let him tell the story. Welcome, Langdon.
Thanks, Mike. It's hard to believe it's been almost 10 years.
I know.
So I feel like I need to have a special 10-year anniversary edition. Maybe that's when the paperback will finally come out. But it's good to be with you all. I hope you've all had dinner, because this is a patch to plate presentation. And I'm going to show you some of the dishes that I like to make. Now, this is primarily about the commercial harvest that's going on out there. But there will be some food photos, I hate to tell you. So I'm going to share my screen here and pull up the slideshow. So bear with me. There we go. Okay, everyone see that? Great, thumbs up, I see that. Okay, if there are any technical issues, somebody please jump on and let me know. I heard last time I spoke, I think to Soma, that there was a little bit of a delay when I was changing slides. So please let me know if there are any foibles or anomalies or other tech book, The Mushroom Hunters. To start, the book was inspired initially by a previous book that I had written called Fat of the Land, which is a collection of essays about wild food foraging. And in there is a chapter on hunting morels. God, this is nearly 20 years ago. It was after the tripod fire in Washington, which was really one of the first big, huge, complex fires that we're so used to now. But at the time, it was scary and new, and I think it was 200,000 plus acres, and we'd never seen anything like that in Washington. So it was a huge burn, and of course it attracted a lot of attention up by the friends to hunt morels. And it was probably a little late in the season. I think it was in June, and already there were quite a few pickers. It was starting to dry out, and it was difficult. And we were going through some pretty rough spots that were really burned. And the picking was just so. And there's some nice morels from that fire. So there were little patches here and there. Me and my friends, there's Chris and Lori there, husband and wife, and I love this picture because you can kind of see he's looking in his basket and also looking in his wife's basket and realizing, maybe she got a few more than him. But as you can see, nothing too special. I mean, I think by the end of the day, and then all of a sudden, these two came out, and they each had big packs on them. And I could see right away that they each probably had about 80 pounds in each of their packs. And these guys kind of looked at us. I don't think they were expecting to see us. And we looked at them with just sort of, we were drooling. And, it was just kind of unfathomable to imagine how they had been out in the bush in these pretty difficult conditions and were able to pick so many mushrooms. And they looked at us and we looked at them, and then they just sort of, without a word, turned on their heels and disappeared back into the burned timber. And that was it. They were gone. But I knew that I had sort of, it was almost like a Bigfoot sighting. I'd had sort of a meeting with a couple of these elusive commercial mushroom pickers that I had heard so much about. Kind of wondered if they might have had some pistols strapped to their sides and whatnot, but never got a real chance to talk to them or find out. And it was at that moment, and I write all about this in my book, Fat of the Land. It was at that moment that I decided, okay, this is my next book. I wanna really kind of try and worm my way into this subculture. Which is so fascinating. and find out how they trying to find these guys, you know, the professionals. But instead, I was kind of running into a lot of, you know, lawn gnomes and some pretty bad chainsaw art, you know, that was out there. And I ended up finding my way to Boyne City, Michigan. Now, Boyne City kind of advertises itself as the Morel capital of the world. And it's true that in the upper Midwest, I mean, they love their Morels. In fact, their Morel culture is probably quite a bit more developed than ours on the West Coast, but they don't know the quantities that we have. And they're pretty happy counting their Morels, you know, in numbers rather than in pounds. But in any event, that's kind of an aside there. They have what they call the world's greatest, you know, mushroom hunting contest or something to that effect. And so I signed up and I hopped on one of the 11 buses that pulled in to the fairgrounds at Boyne City. And they didn't blindfold us, but they took us to an undisclosed location. I didn't see Dick Cheney hiding there, but it was somewhat bunker-like, and we didn't have maps or compasses or any. I probably should have brought compass. In the hardwood forests of Michigan, well, it's so different from what we're used to on the West Coast. First of all, they just have all these different deciduous trees that are kind of bewildering, and they haven't really leafed out yet, and so they're hard to tell. And I was just sort of not in my element, and everyone ran off into the woods. But I met other people who kind of helped me learn some things, and in my travels, I would end up, you know, finding nice patches such as these yellow morels that I found in so I continued to travel around looking for the professionals. But, you know, the guys who won the Morel hunting contest in Boyne City, Michigan, they were really just recreational pickers like the rest of us, very good at it, but they weren't the ones doing it for money. So I continued on the circuit, and oh, here's one of the food photos. I'll just show you what I did with my Morels when I got them home. Little, you know, seasonal dish of pan-fried scallops with some Morels and a spring nettle sauce. I like to try and pair seasonal ingredients as much as I can, and the nettles are coming up at the same time as the Morels, and they work beautifully together. But I continued on the hunt for the professionals, and that brought me to Telluride, where of course they have a long-running festival there, and I met incredible people. I'm not sure really if there are any commercial mushroom hunters there. Lots of really interesting folks like these guys. I think you might recognize the guy on the right. That's none other than the editor of Fungi magazine, Britt Bunyard, incognito there. But lots of characters, including the white rabbit and the Amanita muscaria mobile, and lots of fun to be had in Telluride, Colorado, especially up in the high country where you're finding their beautiful, you know, red-capped porcini, which makes an excellent crostini, I should add, with a little ricotta and some herbs from the garden. My favorite way to have porcini. But, you know, none of these guys were the sort of characters that I had met on that day in the burn. And they remained kind of indistinct to me, sort of faceless and blurry, just sort of far off in the woods, sort of like this guy right here. And so I continued to ask around, and eventually somebody knew somebody who had a friend whose cousin knew somebody, and they introduced me to this guy. So this is Doug Carnell, and he would end up becoming a main character in my book. Doug is what's known as a circuit picker. Now, he's captained a crab boat. He's dug razor clams for profit. He's been a scrap metal artist. He's done all kinds of things. He's also, all sorts of commercial fishing. But the one thing on his resume that's been constant for really probably close to 40 years is wild mushroom harvesting. And so in this sense, he really represents kind of the first wave of professional mushroom hunters in this country who did this job for profit. Doug had also been a logger at one time. And a lot of the original commercial mushroom harvesters were out of work loggers. You know, we live in the Northwest, of course, and I'm thinking, you know, from Northern California all the way up to Southeast Alaska and out to Western Montana and all of Idaho and Oregon and Washington and a good chunk of BC. That's really what these guys call the mushroom trail. If you draw a circle around that area on the map, you can pretty much find wild mushrooms somewhere in that circle every day of the year. Now you have to move around a lot, of course, but that is really the center of the mushroom universe in North America. Now people are harvesting commercially in Saskatchewan and Maine and other places, but it's really the kind of greater Pacific Northwest where most of the action is. And the guys who travel around sort of within the confines of that circle, you know, the greater Pacific Northwest, are known as circuit pickers. And Doug was one of them. He moves with the seasons. You know, the pick moves around and he follows it when he's not doing other odd jobs. So I got to know Doug, and by the way, you might see that he's got a rifle slung over his shoulder there. Well, it's elk season when this was taken, and probably most of the meat that Doug eats during the year is meat that, you know, he is either caught like salmon or shot, you know, like elk and deer. And they go into his deep freeze, and that's his meat for the year. And his cash comes from mushroom picking. He doesn't really, I don't think he has a bank account. He pretty much just deals in cash. And so he is very much representative of this first wave of guys who were doing it for money. You know, he had been a logger, he'd worked in the woods, he knew where the patches were. And when mushrooms started to become kind of a big deal in the late 70s and early 80s, places like in your neighborhood, Chez Panisse and other Bay Area restaurants, and up here, the Herb Farm in Seattle, and others, you know, across the country. Well, these sort of places in the late 70s, early 80s would have what they called sort of the backdoor forager. And that would be the guy who would sort of show up at the back door with a basket of weeds and mushrooms and just a bunch of stuff and sell it to the chef. But over time, as people got more into food and eating well, and local food and organic food, this whole industry really needed more structure to it. And that's kind of when Doug got involved. And that's when you had, you know, field buyers come on the scene and entire companies basically designed to buy these products and sell them to the restaurants and farmers markets. So Doug kind of is part of that first wave. And we will talk about the second and third waves of mushroom pickers, mostly immigrants, but we'll get to them in a minute. So Doug's part of that first wave, and there he is with his hunting rifle in case he stumbles on an elk in the patch. So Doug took me to
So Langdon, we're on hold now.
I just never really in the world of mushroom recreational. Hello? Did you guys lose me?
Yeah, for a minute.
Am I there now?
You are.
Okay, sorry about that.
You know, you may get better service if you go to a black screen on your name while you're showing us your slides. You want to try that?
Sure. How do I do that?
You just take your screen name.
Yep.
And you just choose. You take your video camera and you put the red slash over it on the bottom of your screen. Just click your video camera.
Okay, on the bottom. Okay, let me see if I can.
There's a microphone and a video camera.
Okay, I'm gonna. Yeah, no, I saw.
Sometimes-
Okay, yeah, I see that.
So
Okay,
sometimes
can
that
you-
gives the voice a little more bandwidth.
Okay, let's see. So I don't want to click stop video, or do I?
No, don't do that. Just,
Yes, that is what you want.
Yeah, right there.
there you
How's
go,
that?
just like that.
Okay. Let's see if that works better. But please let me know if I suddenly tune out. So anyway, to go back where I was, Doug introduced me to all sorts of places that I'd never thought about. One of the things I realized was that a lot of the mushroom trade happens in forests that recreational hunters don't particularly want to visit. They tend to be what the pickers call reprod. These are forests that have already been cut, maybe numerous times by the loggers, but these young kind of dense forests that grow up in their place that are kind of managed almost like tree farms often grow incredible crops of mushrooms. They're not necessarily the most scenic to walk through, but you can find a lot of mushrooms. So on this particular day, he took me to a spot out on the Olympic Peninsula, and we pulled over in his crummy Buick Skylark that he was driving around, that I think he got for a couple $100. And it's amazing that thing could make it down the forest roads. And we get out of the car, and he pulls out a giant steak knife that he bought for $1 from the dollar store. And he's got a bucket. Of course, they're not using Guatemalan woven baskets. And he's got jeans on and boots, and he's got a cotton hoodie. I'm in my, Patagonia, space wear, basically, Gore-Tex, this and that. He doesn't have any of that. And he says, follow me. And there's no trail. We're not on a hiking trail. He just starts following kind of the trails through the forest that are made by the bears and the elk and the deer. We're following game trails, and we're heading uphill. And when you walk into a forest like this, it's like walking into a car wash. It's just, you get soaking wet instantly. And we're parting the huckleberry bushes and just scrambling through, going uphill. And eventually I kind of lose Doug. He's loping along on his long legs, and he's pretty fast in the woods. And before long, I can't see him. I can't hear him. And all of a sudden I think, uh-oh, like he's trying to lose me out in these woods on purpose. I suddenly get this paranoid feeling that it's like with sort of macho jobs, like, I don't know, Air Force, guys or firemen or cops or whatever, that he's sort of testing me, and that I'm being kind of hazed. And just like that, as soon as this sort of horrible thought crossed my mind, I hear Doug's voice up ahead, and I sort of chastise myself for not believing. And he's standing on kind of a ridge, and he tells me to come on up. And so I get up there, and he just sort of points down into the ravine below. And I look down, and it's just hedgehog mushrooms as far as the eye can see, more than I'd ever seen. And so there's Doug with a nice handful of hedgehogs on a different day. Unfortunately, I don't have a photo of that. It was just a sight to be seen. But take a look at the background here. I mean, you can see kind of all the dense, not very wide diameter trees. This is all second growth, recent, reprod. And you can see the cedar in the background, the sort of chunks of cedar from the original cut that were left behind, just broken up cedar from when the tree fell or whatever. Well, he knew that cedar that was decaying into the ground from the original cut, that might be 100+ years old, was fueling this incredible hedgehog fruiting. Now, the hedgehogs were obviously mycorrhizal with a different species, probably Doug fir or something like that. But it was this cedar decay in this kind of boggy forest that he was really searching out. And so just learning these little tricks from Doug really opened up a whole new world of mushroom hunting for me. And it was just, he's had very little formal schooling, but he makes these ecological connections, which are pretty incredible. And so I just got on the road with him, and we started picking all over the place, all over Washington, Oregon, down into California. And I started just following him around on the pick, camping with these guys and with his buddies. Here's one of his partner pickers, Jeff Lacey, another guy who had been a commercial fisherman on the East Coast, holding up some nice porcini there. Here he is with a 5-pound cauliflower mushroom that he probably sold for maybe $50. So that's a good find right there. And then, of course, the buyer who bought it probably turned around and sold it to the restaurant for 100 or more. And there's Jeff and Doug on a chanterelle pick, another vehicle. Doug's always, kind of getting rid of one vehicle and finding another for a couple $100. And this one, and you can see there, he's got his Michigan State sweatshirt on. Well, he has that sweatshirt because he knows every consignment store, probably across all 50 states. And he goes to Michigan every spring. In fact, he might be there right now. I should give him a call and find out. But he picks ramps in Michigan, wild leeks. There's a huge trade in that besides just mushrooms. So he's picking all kinds of things. But he's in Michigan and knows where to find a cheap sweatshirt when he needs it. On this particular day, I think they picked about 60 pounds of chanterelles apiece. Excuse me. So after getting to know Doug and spending some time with him, I knew that I had to see the other side of the coin, and that would be the buyer. And of course, I'm sure you've all heard that there's, quite a bit of tension between the pickers and the buyers. And I wanted to fully experience that. So I met this guy, Jeremy Faber, who had started a business in Seattle, I think around 2001, called Foraged and Found Edibles. He had been a restaurant chef and often brought in wild foods on his day off to incorporate into the restaurant's specials. And eventually he realized he just wanted to be out in the woods. So he kind of changed things up, started this company, and started buying from a network of pickers all over the Northwest. And you can see right there, these are the baskets that get traded around, every day. And they're all about the same size. They can be nested. They fit on the back seat of a car or into a walk-in. And they go from picker to buyer to restaurant and back and forth. And of course, there's no way you can hold on to your baskets. You just have to keep trading them around and hope they come back your way. But everybody's always on the lookout for cheap baskets. Everybody needs them constantly. So I started hanging around with Jeremy to see the buying end. And in these years, his business basically just operated out of the basement of his house in Seattle. You can see one of his employees there weighing some mushrooms. And now he has warehouses in New York and in an industrial part of Seattle. But in the beginning, it was just out of his own house. So here's another employee weighing out a cauliflower mushroom. There's some nice porcini in one of their boxes with the logo on it. And basically these guys spend all day cleaning up the mushrooms, boxing them up, and then they get stacked in the van for local deliveries around Seattle, or they get driven down to SeaTac and maybe sent down to San Francisco or to New York, or even Paris and London. I mean, they're going all over the place. So here's Ron Zimmerman, owner of the Herb Farm restaurant just outside Seattle, fine dining establishment that really likes to use wild foods. And he's taking a nice collection there of chanterelles for his annual dinner that he does in October, called the Mycologist's Dream Menu. It's a 9-course feast, and each course includes wild mushrooms, including dessert. He probably got some candy caps from down your way, to incorporate into a nice dessert for that meal. Now, when Jeremy's buying, he needs to have a huge network of pickers to be able to supply really the demand, the constant demand for these products. And so he's on the road all the time. Here we are in Raymond, Washington, which is on the southwestern coast of Washington. And we're actually at the house of a picker named Sang Tran, who's Vietnamese. Now, Sang really represents kind of the second wave of mushroom pickers in this sort of organized new industry that really didn't get codified until probably the early to mid 80s. Sang, and as I mentioned, he's from Vietnam, and he fought in the Vietnamese War on the U.S. side, and eventually fled and came to the U.S. And you will meet out in the patch Cambodians and Lao and all sorts of others from various parts of Southeast Asia, many of them caught up in the wars there during the 60s, 70s. And many of them came over really beginning in the kind of early 80s, which is, I think, when Sang came over. You have huge populations up and down the West Coast in places like Raymond, in Weed, California, in Springfield, Oregon, large populations of Southeast Asian immigrants. A lot of these folks spent years, for instance, fleeing the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and living basically in the jungle. And so it's just amazing to watch them here heading into the patch. I mean, routinely, I would see folks from Southeast Asia just walk into the, these really difficult woods. I consider them pretty difficult, but they'd be in flip-flops, and a lot of cotton, and think nothing of it. No compass, no map, but they can go way back in there and find their way back out with just tons of mushrooms. When you think about it, getting out there into the woods, you don't have a boss. You don't necessarily need to speak the dominant language. A lot of the pickers just had a little bit of English. So, it was a good opportunity. So Sang, in addition to being a picker, will often open up his house to Jeremy as a buying station so that Jeremy can set up shop there and just buy from all the locals. And Sang knows all kinds of people. And so when Jeremy shows up at Sang's house, all of a sudden there's a flurry of phone calls and texts. And I saw this again and again. We would pull up in Jeremy's van, which can hold something like 2,000 pounds of mushrooms. And within 5 minutes, there would be like 20 pickers standing at the back door. And this would all take place in the evening because the pickers are in the woods during the day. And then the grading process would start. Here's a picker with some nice porcini. So this would have been the fall beach pick for porcini, which often will grow, within a stone's throw of the Pacific, as you all probably know. So this was probably, late September. And pickers just start arriving with their baskets, and Jeremy starts grading at that point. And every King Bolete gets cut in half. And that's because Jeremy is looking for any sort of insect damage. Now, take a look at this one. I would see these beautiful looking mushrooms. I mean, this thing is pure white inside. You just want to almost bite into it like an apple. But notice in the sort of upper, area where the pores are, where the sponge is, you can see that little yellow blotch right there. Well, those are eggs. That's some sort of, I think what they called, there's a bunch of different insects. They have kind of basic common names for them. They call them capworms or stem worms or hoppers. I think that might have been a hopper infestation. And literally within maybe hours, this mushroom would be a riddled mess. And so it just gets shunted aside. It's not, maybe it could go into a dryer pile, but if even at a dryer pile, the picker is making a fraction of what he would make if it were in pristine condition. So most of the porcini is graded on a scale of 1 to 3. Ones are the perfect buttons. 2s are slightly more mature mushrooms, but still really good, but a little bit softer. And then the 3s and the 4s are just, those are the dryers. And they usually get put aside, and the picker makes a fraction of the price for the dryers. So here's some mushrooms being weighed out, and then the bill of sale. And of course, it's all done according to the book. You know, Jeremy does his taxes. He sends tax forms to some of his pickers. Who knows what happens to them? But there's a bill. So this particular picker, you can see he sold. He got number 1s, 2s, and 3s. He made 71 and change for the 1s, and 22 for the number 2s, and 9 and change for the 3s, for a total of basically $104. So not a great day, but still some money to be had. I love this photo because it kind of shows the drama of the grading. Often what would happen is pickers would show up and it would be like a family affair. There'd be a pot of rice going, and people would have a beer or soda and have some rice. And often what would happen is the men would hold on to the baskets, and they'd be out by the back door, and their wives would come in and just sort of gather around the kitchen island and hang out and talk and have some rice. But then as soon as hubby's, basket was getting ready to be weighed, well, all eyes are on the buyer, because depending on the quality of the mushrooms, that's how your day's, pay is going to go up and down. And so they're watching very closely to see how Jeremy is grading these different mushrooms. And you can see their emotions kind of riding this roller coaster up and down. It's most of the wives who are actually keeping the accounting going and holding the checkbook. And so they're even more interested than their husbands. But that was in, fairly close to Seattle. I mean, Jeremy would do a trip like that in one day. Granted, he'd get back at midnight when it was all done. But Raymond is, 2.5 hours from Seattle. But we often had to hit the road and go a lot further. So here we are in Darby, Montana, where he actually has to put out his sandwich board and advertise mushroom buyer here on some forest road. This is a burn morel site where there were several other buyers, and we blew into town. And the first thing he did was went up and down, checking out the other buy stands, and he saw that they were all paying about $8 a pound. It wasn't a great burn. There weren't a ton of morels, and yet still the price was only about $8. So what did he do? Well, we went into the woods that day, and every picker that he saw on the roadside, he let them know that he'd just blown into town and he was raising the price to 10. Okay. So he told everybody we met in these conversion vans and old beat up pickups and jalopies, that he was going to raise the price. And so that evening, all the pickers came to our buy stand. There was a long, long line of pickers waiting to sell to Jeremy to get that extra $2, which really meant a lot. And there he is in the orange cap there grading. And I was sort of standing there taking pictures, and I see Jeremy look up every now and then. And eventually I just said, what do you see? And he said, well, there's a white pickup truck that's driven by several times, and I think I know who it is. And I said, well, who is it? And he said, well, I think that's Hong. He's another buyer, and he's obviously not too happy with me raising the price here. And stuff like that would happen all the time. The other buyers would just do things like maybe just drive by a few times, or maybe stop and chat, not say anything in particular, but just let you know that they were aware of what's going on. They weren't too happy with what you were doing. And maybe you should think twice about raising the price like that. But this kind of stuff would go on all the time. And it really made me think of kind of, this frontier style of capitalism that was going on in the woods. old school, you know, frontier style capitalism. And it was just so interesting to watch. Of course, the pickers love to accuse the buyers of collusion, which is illegal. And, you know, I saw kind of, you know, various forms of collusion all the time, but usually not organized. Just, you know, a raised eyebrow or driving by or something like that was enough. But it was amazing to see how the prices would often stay very firm, even when there wasn't a whole lot of supply. And that makes the pickers very angry. But collusion's a very hard thing to prove. That particular burn wasn't so good, but I wanted to show you a photo of what a good burn looks like. This is in Washington. Notice all the needles on the ground there, and notice the fact that there is greenery in the background. Well, this was a creeper fire that came through in the Cascades, and it stressed the trees, but it didn't kill most of them. Maybe it killed the young ones, but most of the older trees survived. And you can see they still have their green foliage, but a lot of them dropped their needles. And the pickers call this the red needle burn. And those red needles just form a really nice kind of duff that holds in the moisture and just can, if the conditions are right, you can have incredible morel picking. And this is what it would look like. I mean, just, you know, right in that, just in the frame of that photo, there's probably 10 pounds of morels. And the big ones, the pickers call hand grenades. Now, look a little closer. It's kind of hard to see because he's wearing a black shirt, but notice that Jeremy's, the hem of his shirt is in his teeth. And that's because he's making a basket out of his shirt. So the bucket is out of reach right now. And so he's putting all the mushrooms in the little sort of, you know, impromptu bucket that he's made by holding the hem of his shirt in his teeth. And those are the little efficiencies that really determine a picker who's going to pick 50 pounds in one day versus one who's going to pick 100 pounds. And that 100-pound number for me really became kind of like my white whale. I was just like so amazed that people could pick 100 pounds because it's such difficult work. It's stoop labor. You're out there bushwhacking around in these rough woods that have been burned. It's hard. But the 100-pound thing just would sort of stick in my craw. And we'll get to that a little later when I made my own attempt. But it's these little efficiencies that pay off with the pickers who can really pick a lot. And when your bucket's out of reach, well, you got to make your shirt a bucket. And Jeremy would buy oversized T-shirts just for this, you know, to be able to do that. Like, look at this shirt right here. Look at how huge it is on him. But it makes a great bucket when it's out of reach. Now, also look here. He's got a pack board of the sort that you would use if you were, say, an elk hunter, you know, to pack out the meat. But instead, he's got the mushroom baskets stacked up on the pack board. That's how you hump 100 pounds of morels out of the bush, with a bunch of baskets stacked on top of each other like that. Each one of those baskets holds probably about a dozen pounds of morels. And then your bucket there, maybe that holds, a big bucket like that, probably holds about 15 pounds. So between the bucket and, say, you know, 7 baskets or so, that's how you get 100 pounds. But believe me, carrying 7 baskets all lashed together with bungee cords on a pack board like that is not easy. Also notice all the greenery in this picture. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that he's looking for. The woods are burned, but not completely. It's not what they call the hot burn, where it's just like, you know, just blackened spars everywhere. I mean, there's still a lot of living trees. There's still plant life. And those are the kind of areas that really produce. Eventually, we would make it up into really some of the halcyon mushroom areas, like the Yukon. I'd always dreamed of picking mushrooms up in the Yukon. I'd been hearing about it. Well, there was a burn, and Jeremy decided he wasn't finding enough mushrooms down in the lower 48. So we bought tickets on some little airline that took us over, you know, BC to Yukon territory, and plopped down in Whitehorse and rented a van. Actually, we rented an SUV. He couldn't get a van, which he was very upset about. But we got as big an SUV as they had. And we drove it 5 hours to the burn, where we basically built a spike camp in the middle of the bush with the grizzly bears and whatnot. And I really settled in to do some professional picking, because I wanted to pay for this whole trip by picking and, recording it as a reporter at the same time. So while we were there, these were some of the burn morels that we saw. Now you might recognize what people call sometimes grays or blondes, Morchella tomentosa. That's really the only burn morel that you can identify with the naked eye. What's labeled there is conica. That's sort of your typical burn morel. And it turns out that we now know through DNA analysis that there's like several different species that kind of look like that. And you need a microscope to separate them. Those would be the main burn morels that end up on restaurant menus, because there's so many of them. But and the pickers just call them conica, which is an out-of-date Latin name that has just stuck to include all those different varieties of burn morels that sort of look the same. But then you have the grays, which are also called blondes, depending on the color phase. And those are sort of special. Jeremy pays extra for those. They're bigger, they're thicker fleshed than the typical burn morels. Chefs love them because they're so meaty. They're really exciting to find. And there were grays all over the place, as well as the conica. The Yukon was just amazing. And we met a lot of interesting pickers. This is not what I recommend, smoking a cigarette with a, perishable food product in your hand, but anything goes up in the Yukon. But you can get a sense of how big these are right there. And then there was another variety, which, I've been told by a mycologist from not this part of the country, from somewhere else in the Midwest, that these don't exist. But here they are. And the pickers just call them greenies or pickles. And they have sort of a greenish hue to them. They're even thicker walled than the grays. Takes forever to dry them. They're just amazing. And we were seeing baskets come out of the woods of these guys. It was amazing. There's also a huge morel up there that they call bananas. I mean, there's definitely, somebody needs to get up there and start sending some of these species in for DNA analysis, because I think we have a lot more species than we realize. So here's a picker unloading his batch. Jeremy really took a shine to this woman. She was from Vancouver and was spending the summer at the burn, just picking, making some money. And he just really liked her. I mean, what's not to like about, motorcycle boots, camo pants, bikini top, and then a homemade mosquito net, on top. And so he gave her an extra 25 cents a pound. But she also brought in really nice morels that were well cleaned, well trimmed, and often the pickers will reward, or the buyers will reward their best pickers with a little extra. And so he gave her an extra quarter for her morels, and she was awesome. And this other guy, he just seems to be happy standing next to her. But we ran into all sorts of amazing characters in the Yukon. It was a scene. Now check this out. This is another buyer. Notice the arms crossed, the body language here. He wasn't too happy. So Jeremy had he'd done what he often does. He blew into town, assessed the situation. I think the buyers were paying $4 Canadian per pound for all the different types of morels. And so Jeremy immediately raised it to $5 for Conica US and $6 for grays and greenies. And so this buyer here, he was a field buyer who worked for a large company, and obviously his higher ups were not happy with his performance once Jeremy came to town and all the pickers were coming to Jeremy's stand. And so he showed up at our camp one day, and you can see them squaring off there like a couple of roosters. And the way they ended up working it out was that Jeremy agreed to buy all the inventory from this particular field buyer, but he wasn't going to drop his prices. And that meant he was going to take a lot of, mushrooms that were probably going to end up being dryers because they weren't as good quality, but he'd dry them and sell them during the winter. But that was how he kept the peace. Also, you can see that he's using produce boxes because he ran out of baskets. So we had to make, the hour drive to town, which was this tiny town called Watson Lake of like maybe 1,000 people, and or probably less. And he just went to all the grocery store and got all the produce boxes he could find. So that's sometimes what you have to do in a pinch. And then every other day, we would make the 5-hour drive to Whitehorse and then the 5-hour drive back so that he could ship all, whatever, a couple 1,000 pounds down to Seattle to his staff and keep all the restaurants happy. Of course, I mentioned dryers. You can see here a buyer drying some just out in the sun on screens. Look at that. That's a lot of mushrooms right there. Almost all those are going to go to Europe. They love them in Switzerland, Germany, France, elsewhere, and they do a lot of buying on the dry market. A couple of things I like to make with my morels when I get them home. And by the way, I should say that I paid for my whole trip. I think I spent about 10 days up in the Yukon and paid for my plane tickets and everything just by picking mushrooms, and then actually came out with a tidy profit on top of that. So it ended up being a great trip. But here's something I do every spring. The Columbia River springers are coming up at the same time that the morels are popping, and then making a nice little Willamette Valley Pinot Noir reduction is a great meal. And I love to get into the surf and turf. I'm a big Sichuanese fan. So a little gooey duck with morels is right up my alley. And then a little more traditional, this is a lamb neck ragu, just a cheap piece of lamb that you make a ragu out of, and then some fava beans, another seasonal ingredient, which goes great with the morels. Lots of different textures, flavors, and then with orecchietta, the little ears, I love those. So just so much fun to experiment in the kitchen with these amazing ingredients that I think they were going for like $30 a pound at the Pike Place Market. So if you can go find them yourself, as you all know, it's a much better deal. Okay, on the heels, we're kind of going in chronological order, by the way, because the other big mushroom of spring is also out. And a place like Sisters, Oregon is the place to go when you want to buy a whole bunch of spring kings. Aren't they awesome? Just nutty flavor, so delicious. The chefs have really learned just to appreciate porcini culture. And we're so fortunate that, we get both a spring and a fall season. And so in places like Weed, California, all the towns around Mount Shasta, and then up in Klamath Falls, and Sisters, Oregon, and Trout Lake, Washington. Those are all big places to set up the buying stand and buy spring kings. This is in Sisters, where a whole sort of encampment crops up every year, and you see the tarps and the tents, and even kind of stringers from the woods that are nailed together with tarps over them. I mean, the people might spend a couple of months in a camp like this. Oregon is probably the most on top of the commercial mushroom trade of the West Coast states, certainly more than Washington. I know that, California, that's a whole, we'll talk about California later when we get to winter pick. That's a totally different issue down there. But in Oregon, they're very strict. There are a lot of rules to follow. There's permits, there's Here's a sign in multiple languages explaining that this particular forest is closed. So they move it around from different, state forests and federal forests. They try and keep the pickers kind of moving around. And they also have designated camp spots for them and designated spots for the buyers, as you can see here. So it's very regulated in Oregon. And then there's permits as well. And Jeremy would have to check everybody's permits. He does everything by the book, doesn't want to get into trouble. So here's some pickers coming in at the end of the day with some kings and a few morels. The whole drama of the buying starts over again. And I mean, I could just sit and watch this for hours. Just fascinating, and just talk shop with the pickers. Find out kind of where they've been going and what they look for and all of that. So there's the permit. Some nice blonde morels there. And then, of course, in these encampments, you have other people who are not maybe picking morels, and porcini, but instead they found other ways to make a buck. Again, it's this frontier style capitalism in the woods. And so you have, the curry stand, right? And at the end of the day, you're tired, you've been picking, maybe you're just gonna surrender $5 for a bowl of chicken curry with rice. And so that's how this person is making their living. So you see a lot of that. And here's Jeremy getting the baskets ready. And that's a beautiful king right there. Few of them. They're just, when they're pristine like that, they're just so, it just gets the heart fluttering. Some of the stuff I like to cook every now and then, I'm a pretty big fan of just a rich, decadent pasta. This porcini kind of red sauce with, there's some prosciutto in there as well, which I don't mention in the slide, but really, really good. I love porcini. But, so that's the spring, Morels and spring kings. But, it doesn't quiet down after that. A lot of people think that in the Northwest during our sort of dry, summer, when it's, the few months when people like to come to Seattle and, oh, look at the sun is out. They don't think of that as mushroom time. But in fact, there's always something happening. And you go into these old growth forests that really hold their moisture well. In late July and August, well, that's the time to pick lobster mushrooms. And so there's a busy lobster trade right in the heat of summer. Look at the size of that one right there. These have become very popular just in the last 5 years. When I first started writing the book, lobsters were still somewhat of an oddity, but now they're pretty entrenched, and you see them all over menus, and the chefs love them. And so there's a pretty bustling trade for lobsters. As the rains pick up in the fall, they start to get kind of nasty. So the summer is a great time to pick them. They're dry, they're pristine, just really, really good quality. So yeah, the lobsters kind of carry the pickers and the buyers through the hot summer. This is my Maine lobster meets Washington lobster mushroom risotto, which is something I make every year. But also in the summer, you might be surprised to know that that's really when the chanterelle harvest starts. By August, it's in full gear. Maybe not down where you are, but up in the woods of the Olympic Peninsula and in the coastal range of Oregon and in British Columbia, it's happening. Now, as you look in the background there, you see a lot of forest, a lot of Doug fir forest there. That is all second growth forest. This is the Southern Olympic Peninsula. It's been cut to ribbons. Everything is second, third, fourth, fifth growth. But that's the place to go if you want to pick these guys. the Pacific Golden Chanterelle. There's obviously a lot of different chanterelles, but this is the backbone of the chanterelle harvest, the Pacific Golden Formosus. And by August, it's going strong if you know where to look. And certainly out on the Olympic Peninsula, there's stuff happening in those second growth Douglas fir forests. And all the way down into, Humboldt, where you have the Doug fir, and probably south of there, you're going to have, commercial chanterelle harvest. So here's Doug and Jeff once again. It's probably September now, and they're walking along on a ridge top. This is an old logging spur, and basically they're just diving off either side of this spur downhill on the slope. So we're on the ridge here, and they're just making their way downhill and picking chanterelles. And Doug's crummy blue skylark is parked, probably a mile away or something. And basically, over the course of this day, what we did is we made our furthest kind of picks at the beginning. So we started far away from the car and picked buckets, and then kind of they would return to the car and dump their mushrooms, and then go back out and not go quite as far. And then by the end of the day, they were picking right around the car. And in that way, they each picked on that particular day 60 pounds of chanterelles. And that's what you have to do with chanterelles, because the price is never that great for chanterelles, except at the very beginning of the season and sometimes at the end of the season. But, eventually there's a glut of chanterelles, and the prices really drop. Whereas with, Morels, probably Morels are the best money maker year in and year out. You've probably heard that matsutake can be very lucrative, but that price fluctuates wildly. Morels are always pretty good, and then chanterelles, not so much. So you got to pick volume with chanterelles, and it's hard. It's stoop labor. You're picking a ton of mushrooms. So here's 1,000 pounds of chanterelles. That's what 1,000 pounds looks like. And that's in the basement of a Cambodian family in Elma, Washington. And they got paid $2 a pound for that. And you might think, well, that's not very much. Well, for them it was. They were happy to get that $2,000. That represented, I don't know, probably several days between multiple generations of the family. The parents were picking, the kids did all the heavy lifting if they were old enough, like lifting the baskets and the buckets into the cars. And then the grandparents did the cleaning. And so they got everybody in the family involved, and that $2,000 meant a lot to them. So some of the things I like to make with chanterelles, they're so, that fruitiness is something that you really want to play with. They're just so good. But really, the sky's the limit. They're just the chefs. The chanterelles are really kind of the backbone. I think probably most even recreational mushroom hunters in the Northwest, this is the starter, the gateway mushroom. And this is the mushroom you're most likely to see on a restaurant menu. And so there's lots of chanterelles being sold and bought. But more recently, in recent years, the chefs have decided they really like those little chanterelles that they call curl cap. And you can see in this photo how the cap hasn't really opened up into that fluted goblet-like shape yet. It's curled over, and they call it curl cap. But they're small, and so the pickers get extra for picking the curl cap. But the chefs love them because they look kind of cute on the plate. I love to take those small chanterelles, especially at the beginning of the season when it hasn't rained a lot, and you don't have those big soggy chanterelles, which the pickers and buyers call flowers. And you'll see on Facebook people bragging about chanterelles as big as their heads, but those from a culinary standpoint are really inferior. These early season, tight, small button chanterelles are just so good. They're so full of flavor. They have great texture. They're perfect for pickling. So that's what I do with a lot of my early season chanterelles. Let's get on to matsutake. We're now later in the season because matsutake doesn't come out until it gets a little colder. And of course, this is a famous pick all over the Northwest, with most of the matsutake going to Japan. You know, a huge percentage of it. Here's Doug walking one of the old railroad grades on the Olympic Peninsula, where they used to have, you know, a donkey, a steam donkey, hauling the timber out, and they had, you know, the tracks going through the woods, and eventually these got pulled up. But those old railroad grades grow mushrooms like a crop. They're well drained, they're mossy, and if you know where those old railroad grades are, you're going to get into mushrooms. So here's Doug picking with his little dog, picking. I'm trying to remember the name of that dog. Buddy Ramp was his name, and he's picking matsutake on the railroad grade. But really, the action for the matsutake, you might be surprised to find out, is on the dry side of the mountains, in the rain shadow of the Washington and Oregon Cascades. So a place like Chemult, which is just north of Crater Lake. Don't blink because you'll miss it when you're driving through. Tiny little town, but this is one of the centers of the matsutake trade in North America. Any given year, there might be 3,000 pickers in Chemult. And take a look at how dry these pine forests are. You're talking about lodgepole pine, ponderosa pine. There's a little bit of noble fir and some Doug fir in there, but pretty dry conditions, not conditions that you would associate with a good mushroom pick. But sure enough, they get a great matsutake harvest. And I talk about this in the book. I don't have time to go into it at length, but I mean, this was scouted out by Japanese prospectors back in the 80s who started asking around for pickers to be on the lookout for matsutake. And eventually they found it. And for a while, prices just went crazy in the 90s. But now it's really settled down, and it's sort of a boom and bust kind of thing. I think one year when I was there, the pickers were getting about $20 a pound for number ones and twos. But the last time I was there, it was more like $5 a pound. So it really goes up and down. But like Sisters, you can see they have semi-permanent shelters that the pickers will stay in. And they'll have whole families there and support networks and people doing laundry and cooking and all of that. So it can be a team effort. Here you've got a guard dog, pretty smart actually. My friend Eric Johnson, who I did some traveling with, took this photo. He uses a large format camera, gets amazing pictures. He's done a whole series of pictures on mushroom hunters, which actually a magazine down in your neighborhood put together with words by me and pictures by him, a profile on this. It's in Sunday Magazine. I think you can find it online. But he's had these photos in art galleries all over the place, and he's got a whole series of them. My slide is not doing it justice. His stuff is incredibly detailed and just amazing. And we go matsutake hunting every year, and we did some traveling around together. You see these signs, don't rake. That was a problem during the 90s and early aughts. But now everybody's pretty good about not raking to find those matsutake buttons hiding under the duff. Here's a buyer and picker named Joy, and he's showing me the little implement that he uses to just kind of, you know, move away some duff or dirt to locate a little emerging cap. And in this slide, you can barely, I don't think I can even see the cap, but there's a mushroom down there. And he remembers, you know, where to go. So he knows the zip codes of every kind of patch, every tree, because certain trees produce year after year. And his mother was a picker, and so she handed down, he's Cambodian, by the way, and spent many years in a Thai refugee camp before making it to the US. But I think he learned from his mother, and she told him specific trees to go to. And that's how a lot of these patches kind of get handed down with it like a family heirloom almost. Notice how dirty they are. That's the way the buyers want them, because most of these are going to Japan, where they're going to be auctioned off, sometimes for exorbitant sums. And the Japanese want to see that that dirt is still on the mushroom. They don't want the stipe cut. They want the stipe intact, and they want to see a little dirt clinging to it, because that's the life force. And they know that these mushrooms have to travel a long distance to get to them. So here's some pickers in camp. This is not in Chemult. This is over by Crescent Lake, where there's a sort of a more wildernessy encampment in the national forest. And I just camped with these guys and told stories. And, you know, this guy's fanning his earnings there. His name was Forrest, and he made $500 that day. So he did pretty well. But sitting around the fire, you know, having a beer, talking about mushrooms, and it's like being in Steelhead camp. I mean, it's a lot of fun. And these guys are they're kind of BSing each other and trying to throw each other off the scent, and, you know, maybe not telling exactly where they found what, or maybe giving a false, you know, directional. So it's fun. And then eventually the truck pulls up. This is a truck that all the buyers help pay for. And this guy goes around to each buy stand and picks up the matsutake, because it has to get to Portland that night and be on the next flight to Japan. So every day, you know, sometime during the night, the truck stops by the buy stand, and all the buyers go in and pay for this driver. You'll also see buy stands, all kinds of crazy places. You'll see them like in this old gas station, or this was becoming more popular, the shipping container. Hey, you know, if the bullets start flying, that's a good place to be. Although I'm really just kidding. I never, you know, I did see some guns on the mushroom trail, but didn't really run into too much trouble. Not with mushroom pickers, but once when I was camped, I did run into some tweakers. That was in Northern California, actually, and that was scary. And they had guns, but they were not pickers. So you hear a lot about territorial mushroom pickers, but I didn't have a lot of problems with them. Just showing off some matsutake. This one has a little tear in the veil, so that's going to be like a number 2 or number 3. That's not going to get the highest price. They want that veil to be completely intact for a number 1. And then, you know, there it is again. You know, just like we saw in Sisters with somebody with a little curry stand. Well, this is a little more elaborate. We had the noodle house. I'm sure this was not permitted, but you could walk into this semi-permanent structure, salvaged wood and tarps and things like that, but get yourself a nice bowl of $2, $3 pho. That was open every night. And while I was there was a big festival. A lot of the Southeast Asian pickers are Buddhist, and they wanted to raise money for a new Buddhist temple in Springfield, Oregon. And there were a few Buddhist monks running around, and I gave him $5, I think, for a blessing, and he blessed my book. So we went to a party that night where they were raising money for the temple, and there was a karaoke band. And if you've heard of a movie about the matsutake pick called The Final Season, or I think it's The Last Season, and it's about a Vietnam vet who is turned picker, and the friendship that he makes with a guy that he would have been on the other team when he was in Vietnam, a Cambodian picker, and they become friends in the patch. But I haven't seen it. I really need to. So they were filming, though, at the same time that I was there meeting some of these people. And in terms of some of the stuff I like to do, just a very simple sake marinade and grilled with a little ponzu dipping sauce. That's just soy sauce with a squeeze of lime. Really nice. Shellfish, incredible umami bomb there between the mushrooms and the shellfish, and just steamed in some sake. Really nice. And probably my very favorite thing to do is Sukiyaki Hot Pot, which is super fun to do with a bunch of people, and just have the hot pot bubbling and everybody's you know, using their chopsticks to throw stuff into the hot pot. And the matsutake just gives the broth such a nice, complex flavor. Okay, I'm trying to keep things moving here because I know we've all got other stuff to do. But this is the final season here. This is winter pick. Most of winter pick happens just north of your border in Brookings, Oregon. That's where most of the pickers kind of go. Now, some cross the border and head down into California, but you know, the legal landscape they run into is so much more different. In Brookings, you have tons of national forest. It's pretty wide open. There's, you know, lots of opportunity for picking the three main winter species, and you see pickers in the same kind of habitats, you know, with their semi-permanent, you know, camps with the little stovepipe coming out there, keep them warm. But you see that in Brookings, but down in California, you don't see that. And it's much more clandestine. And that's because just so much of California is closed to picking. And I know you guys experience that too as a recreational picker. So most of the pickers will stay, you know, in Brookings and hunt that area. But they're looking for the three main winter species, black trumpets being the primary, and then yellowfoot, and finally belly button hedgehogs. So those are the big three for the winter pick. And yeah, I mean, I love all three of those, and I love the winter pick. It's a lot of fun. I did end up going into California with Doug, as a matter of fact, a few times, and we picked the Lost Coast on one occasion, and you know, a lot of that has been logged, of course, but what Doug thinks is just the way that sort of old growth cedar was fueling the pick up on the Olympic Peninsula. He really believes that that old growth redwood that's all been logged out, but still remains in the forest in the form of stumps and shattered trees, you know, and just all kinds of debris that's left over from the logging. He really believes that that redwood decay is helping to fuel the wonderful black trumpet, yellowfoot, and hedgehog picking. And, you know, those mushrooms are probably mycorrhizal with the Douglas fir and the tan oak and madrone. But of course, there's a lot of that redwood decay in the ground now, with the second growth forest having grown up around it. So we spent some time in different parts of Northern California picking, but that was all very kind of clandestine, hidden camps in the woods, you know, kind of secretive buys, not really, you know, making your presence known. I'm sure that probably some folks want to talk about some of that stuff. I know that, you know, I haven't gotten into it much. I know, especially down in California, the whole commercial trade really rubs people the wrong way. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that so much is closed in California. And we're seeing more of that happen now in Oregon and Washington. But from my experience, I rarely saw, except for, say, a burn site for Morels, I rarely saw commercial pickers and recreational pickers picking the same patches. The commercial guys really stuck to different sort of ground, often the sort of ground that recreational pickers just didn't want to pick, because it's difficult, it's not very scenic, it's not very fun in some respects. They can be difficult woods. You know, my biggest gripe with the commercial stuff is just the trash, leaving trash in the woods. And Doug would, to his credit, whenever we saw trash, he'd always put it in his bucket and haul it out. But of course, not all the commercial pickers are that way. So just to wind up here, we're back in Brookings, and you know, I told you how the pickers kind of they gripe about the buyers kind of fixing prices and talk about collusion, and the buyers tell the pickers that they should read up on the, you know, the laws of supply and demand and learn more about economics. But I have to say, when I visited the the Blue Coastal Suites Inn in Brookings, California, and saw, you know, buyers set up in rooms 23 and 24, you know, right next to each other, and they were paying 75 cents a pound for yellowfoot. Well, I kind of saw it from the picker's perspective. That just didn't seem very fair, and not much more for black trumpets either. So a couple things I like to do with these winter mushrooms. I love making a winter risotto with all butternut squash and Brussels sprouts and good stuff. And then, you know, very few foods are jet black. I can think of squid ink as being another, but they really, those black trumpets have a wonderful contrast color-wise. You know, wonderful in a ragu with some polenta. And then they are the garnish in my chanterelle, cream of chanterelle soup. And I like to say that the black trumpet kind of out shanties the chanterelle, because it really, it almost has like a distillation of that chanterelle flavor. I just love them. They're so good. I wish they were more common up here, but they are in Washington, but you got to know where to go, and they're just not nearly as common as along the Northern California coast. So one more slide for you here, and then we can get to some questions if there are any. You can see me here with the accoutrements of the commercial picker. And as I mentioned, I was fixated on the 100 pounds. You know, it was as I said, it was my white whale. And I really wanted to get 100 pounds. And so here's a shot of me in the Yukon, and I've got 4 baskets. You know, each one holds about 12 pounds. I've got a bucket that's out of frame there, maybe holding another 15 pounds. So right there, you know, this is lunchtime, by the way. It's the land of midnight sun. So we probably started picking at 6 a.m., you know, right outside of camp. And at that point, I probably have like 65 pounds. And I've just finished lunch, and I'm heading back into the bush. And Jeremy took this photo of me. And so I was determined, all I needed was another 35 pounds after lunch, you know, to hit that magic 100-pound number. And to find out, you're just going to have to read the book.